My name is Rebecca Carter, and this is the story of how I turned the worst phase of my life into the greatest victory against workplace injustice. At 35, I was a single mother, struggling every day to raise Tyler, 9, and Emma, 6, alone, in Columbus, Ohio. Every morning began at 5 a.m. The alarm rang shrill, cutting through the silence of the night like a blade, and I, even with my body heavy with fatigue, got up immediately. Going down to the kitchen was almost a ritual, making coffee, preparing the lunch boxes, laying out the kids' uniforms. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the soft sound of the radio marked the start of our routine. Tyler always appeared first, his hair messy and his eyes half closed, rubbing his face with his hand. "Mom, you're awake again?" he would ask, almost as if he couldn't believe I never rested. I would smile, even with my eyes red from sleep, and say, "Mom always wakes up early to take care of you, sweetheart." Shortly after, Emma would come in, carrying her favorite doll, still sleepy but with that innocent sparkle in her eyes that gave me the strength to keep going. By 6:30 a.m., I was already at Sunrise Manor, a long-term care home serving 120 elderly residents. My badge would pass through the turnstile, and from there another marathon would begin. I wasn't just an employee, in many ways, I was the heart of that place. My official shift was from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., but that rarely happened. Medical emergencies arose, patients fell, families called desperately, and often there was only the silence screaming in every room. My heart wouldn't let me ignore an elderly person who needed attention, even if it meant sacrificing time with my children. I knew I wouldn't get an extra cent, but I couldn't just turn my back. There was one patient who left a deep mark on me, Mrs. Ruth Johnson, an 84-year-old woman who had lost her entire family in a car accident. Every morning, the first thing I did was visit her. "Good morning, Mrs. Ruth. How did you sleep?" I would say, adjusting her pillows and checking her medication tray. She would hold my hand and reply, with a fragile but tender smile. "Better now that you're here, dear Rebecca." Those simple words, repeated every day, were like fuel for my soul. As I ran through the halls, taking care of every detail, Richard Blackwood, the owner of Sunrise Manor, would only show up around 10 a.m. He was a 50-year-old man, always immaculate in $2,000 suits, flaunting luxury watches that gleamed like trophies on his wrist. He would enter with an air of superiority, spend a few hours in the office with the air conditioning on, claiming important meetings, and by 2 p.m., he was already heading to a business lunch. In the garage, his black BMW shone like a trophy of arrogance. And as if that weren't enough, he frequently switched cars, flaunting even more expensive models, while I prayed every morning that my old 2008 Honda Civic, which made strange noises when starting, wouldn't break down on me. To Blackwood, we weren't people. We were just numbers on a spreadsheet, replaceable pieces in his money-making machine. At that moment, I had no idea how far his greed and coldness would go. The first time I mustered the courage to speak with Richard Blackwood about overtime was on a rainy Tuesday in October. The sky was gray, rain streaked down the windows of Sunrise Manor, and it felt as if the whole world shared my exhaustion. I had worked until 9 the night before because Mrs. Johnson had a panic attack and needed special attention. With trembling hands and a racing heart, I knocked on his office door. I took a deep breath and walked in. The room was completely different from the rest of the institution: soft carpet, overly cold air conditioning, dark wood furniture, and the smell of imported coffee. While the patients and we caregivers faced the rush of the corridors, Blackwood lived isolated in his private palace. "Mr. Blackwood, I need to talk to you about the overtime I've been doing," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. I held a notebook where I recorded every minute worked beyond schedule. He didn't lift his eyes from the computer. He typed as if I didn't exist. Only after a few seconds of uncomfortable silence did he respond, emotionless. "Rebecca, when you accepted this job, you knew that caring for the elderly requires dedication. No one here needs extra money. You already earn enough for your basic needs." For a moment, I felt my face burn. My whole body trembled, but I took a deep breath and insisted. "Sir, it's about 15 extra hours per week. I have 2 children to raise alone. That money makes all the difference for us." He lifted his eyes for the first time, staring at me with coldness and disdain. His mouth curved into an ironic smile. "Conversation over," he said curtly. "If you're not satisfied with the conditions, you can look for another job. There are dozens of people who would kill for your position." His words felt like a punch to the stomach. I felt my legs weaken. I left the office with my eyes brimming with tears, but I wouldn't let him see them. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, helping Tyler with his math homework while Emma colored with crayons. But my mind was elsewhere. I did the calculations. If Blackwood paid my overtime correctly, it would be about $270 more per week. That meant buying the new sneakers Tyler desperately needed, his old ones were too tight, and maybe fulfilling Emma's dream, ballet classes. While my children smiled innocently, I swallowed my frustration. Blackwood flaunted suits and expensive watches, while I counted coins to fill the car tank. And he still had the audacity to say we already earned enough for basic needs. It was too much humiliation. I didn't know it yet, but that moment would be only the beginning of a much larger battle. Weeks turned into months. I kept working without rest, while Richard Blackwood displayed more and more of his arrogance. Now, he not only arrived in a new, shiny silver BMW, but he also made a point of parking it in the spot closest to the entrance, so everyone could see. I would pass by him in my 2008 Honda Civic, which creaked every time I started it, feeling the worlds apart difference rubbed in my face. He paraded a different watch every day, all extremely expensive, while I calculated whether I'd have enough money to fill the tank until the end of the week. That discrepancy hurt. But nothing hurt more than looking at Tyler and Emma and knowing I couldn't provide everything they deserved, even while working so hard. The moment that changed everything happened on a cold December night. The chill in Columbus was biting, and the wind seemed to pierce right through to the bones. I was about to finish my shift when I heard a scream from Mrs. Ruth Johnson's room. I ran immediately. She had fallen in the bathroom and fractured her hip. The sound of her crying, confused and scared, was etched into my memory. The ambulance rushed her to the hospital, and I stayed on standby until her return, which only happened in the middle of the night. When she came back, she was even more fragile, her eyes teary, not fully understanding what had happened. I simply couldn't leave her alone in that condition. I spent 16 straight hours at Sunrise Manor that night. I accompanied Mrs. Ruth's return, comforted 3 families who received difficult news, organized the medications for the morning shift, and even prepared detailed reports of each incident. My feet hurt so much it felt like I was walking on sharp stones. My back burned. But I kept going, because someone had to do it. When I finally got home, at 11 the next morning, the house was silent. Tyler and Emma were already at school. I had lost another morning with them, another family breakfast, another opportunity to see their smiles before they started their day. The emptiness of the kitchen seemed to scream. The next day, I gathered courage again and went to Blackwood's office. This time, I brought all my notes from the past weeks. I placed the papers on his desk without trembling. "Sir, I worked 16 hours yesterday. That's 9 overtime hours which, by federal law, should be paid with a 50% premium," I said firmly. He took the documents, flipped through them with disinterest, and raised his eyes, visibly irritated. "Rebecca, you chose to stay. No one asked you to work so much," he replied curtly. "And this obsession with overtime is affecting your performance. Consider this a verbal warning." It was like he had punched me in the stomach. Anger rose in my throat, but I swallowed it in silence. Not only was he denying me a basic right, but he was also accusing me of poor performance precisely because I cared too much about the patients. That night, I sat in the kitchen, surrounded by piling bills. The rent was overdue. The electricity bill had a disconnection notice. Tyler needed new glasses because his had broken at school. And Emma asked me, almost every day, if she could start ballet classes, but I had no way to pay for them. I looked at the notebook where I religiously recorded every hour worked. Each line in that notebook represented not only time lost with my children but also the disrespect of a man who believed he could do whatever he wanted. At that moment, I made a silent but decisive decision: I would no longer accept this injustice. After that night, my life changed. I could no longer accept silent exploitation. If Blackwood thought he could silence me with veiled threats, he was mistaken. I began documenting everything even more carefully. Every overtime hour, every shift that stretched beyond the limit, every situation in which I was forced to stay. I photographed the time clock. I recorded conversations, always with the consent of colleagues who also felt wronged. I created a huge file, almost a dossier, that grew week by week. And it didn't take long for me to discover I wasn't alone. Talking discreetly in the break room, I heard accounts that left me outraged. "Rebecca, are you sure you want to mess with this?" whispered Jennifer Williams, an afternoon shift caregiver, glancing around fearfully. "Blackwood has a lot of power in this city. He knows the mayor, has friends on the council." I took a deep breath and replied, "That's exactly why he feels entitled to exploit us. But federal law is on our side. It doesn't matter how many friends he has." Jennifer wasn't the only one. Mike Peterson, from the night shift, also had unpaid overtime hours. Sandra Miller, who worked in the kitchen, confessed she had spent entire weeks doing double shifts without receiving anything beyond her base salary. The pattern was clear: Blackwood had turned exploitation into house policy. It took me weeks to find a lawyer willing to take my case. Most listened to my story with looks of compassion, but when it came to fees, $300 per hour, I knew it was completely out of my reach. I could barely afford rent as it was. That's when a friend from church, upon hearing my situation, referred me to Michael Thompson, a labor lawyer known in the community for taking on abusive employers. His office was far from downtown, in a simple building, without luxury. But I wasn't seeking luxury, I was seeking justice. Michael was a 45-year-old black man who knew firsthand what it was like to fight against inequality. When he heard my story and saw my documentation, he looked up at me seriously. "Rebecca, your documentation is impressive. You have solid evidence of Fair Labor Standards Act violations. I'm willing to take your case." I felt tears well up, but this time they weren't of humiliation, they were of hope. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. In January, we filed the lawsuit. It was like crossing an invisible line from which there was no return. And Blackwood found out the same day. Columbus was a big city, but news traveled too fast when it involved influential people. The next morning, he summoned me to his office. Upon entering, I realized I wasn't alone with him. Two men in suits were there, with stern expressions and leather folders on the desk. "Rebecca, you've made a serious mistake," said Blackwood, pacing the office like a predator in his golden cage. "You are defaming a respected company with false allegations. This could have serious consequences for your career, and for your family." My breathing grew heavy, but I maintained my posture. "I am not defaming anyone. I'm simply asking for what is rightfully mine." One of the men in a suit intervened, his voice cold and calculated. "Your recent behavior has been problematic. Late arrivals, negative attitude, negligence with patients. We have documented reports." I almost laughed nervously. I knew it was a lie. My evaluations had always been impeccable. I had letters from patients' families praising my care and dedication. But there was their strategy, to paint me as a problematic employee to justify a termination for cause. I left that office with trembling legs, but with my resolve even firmer. They were not going to break me. After I filed the lawsuit, life at Sunrise Manor turned into a silent battlefield. Blackwood knew he couldn't fire me immediately, that would strengthen my retaliation claim. So he chose another path, to wear me down to the limit. The following weeks were a true hell. Blackwood began assigning me tasks that were nearly impossible. One morning, he left a list of orders on my desk. Clean all 3 floors of the building alone in a single shift. Reorganize the medical files of 120 patients by the end of the day. Take a double shift without prior notice, even knowing I was already exhausted. When I inevitably failed to meet these absurd demands, he recorded it as a performance failure in internal reports. It was a dirty game, carefully orchestrated to try to destroy my credibility. And it wasn't just at work. The harassment spilled into my personal life. One day, Emma came home crying, her eyes swollen and her face red. "Mom, why are people being mean to me?" she asked, sobbing. I found out that some children at school had started mocking her and Tyler. They said I was a liar and that we were suing important people in the city. Tyler, trying to be strong, said he didn't care, but I could see in his eyes the weight he was carrying. My heart broke. I wanted to protect them from all of it, but I felt powerless to shield them from the cruelty of the world. For a few moments, I seriously considered giving up. Dropping the lawsuit, keeping my job, and preventing my children from continuing to suffer. But then, as if fate wanted to give me an answer, I had a conversation with Mrs. Ruth Johnson that changed everything. On a quiet evening, I sat beside her to adjust her blankets. She held my hand firmly, her eyes teary but full of tenderness, and said, "Rebecca, you are the bravest person I know. Don't let bad men defeat good people like you." Those words echoed inside me like a cry of resistance. It was as if she was reminding me that my fight wasn't just for me, it was for everyone. And it was during this same period that Michael, my lawyer, called me with news that reignited my hope. "Rebecca, we found internal company documents. They prove a systematic pattern of violations. Blackwood wasn't just denying your overtime, he instructed supervisors not to pay any employee." My hand trembled as I held the phone. Michael continued, firm and confident. "We're talking about something big, Rebecca. This practice saved the company around $150,000 a year. This could be a game changer." At that moment, I realized I wasn't just fighting for my salary or my time with my children. I was fighting against an entire system of exploitation. And, for the first time, I saw a real possibility of winning. The weight of that battle was already consuming me from within, but what happened next turned my personal struggle into something much bigger. The case was no longer just Rebecca versus Richard Blackwood and began to spread through the streets of Columbus, and, in a short time, across the country. It was thanks to Lisa Morgan, an investigative journalist from the Columbus Dispatch. She had received an anonymous tip that Sunrise Manor was under investigation. Lisa was known for not being afraid to confront powerful people, and when she heard my story, she decided to dive deep. I remember the first interview I gave her. I was nervous, my hands sweating so much that I had to squeeze a teacup to hide it. But Lisa reassured me with her firm posture and determined gaze. "Rebecca, what you have is bigger than you think. If we tell this story, it will open many people's eyes." Days later, the headline ran on the front page of the newspaper. "Local nursing home accused of exploiting employees." My photo, in a blue uniform, appeared next to the title. Inside the article, Lisa detailed how single mothers like me were being systematically exploited. The documents Michael had found were cited, and the names of other employees who confirmed the scheme were printed in black letters for the whole state to see. The response was immediate. My Facebook page, until then restricted to friends and family, was flooded with messages of support. People from all over the country wrote things like, "Rebecca, your courage is inspiring. I went through the same situation but never had the strength to fight. You are paving the way for all of us. On Twitter, the hashtag Justice for Rebecca emerged and quickly gained traction. Local radio programs began inviting me for interviews, and even small TV channels wanted to hear my side. It was strange seeing my face associated with the word justice on screens, but at the same time, it was encouraging to realize I was no longer alone. However, this exposure also brought a new kind of battle. Blackwood, realizing he was losing ground, hired a public relations firm to try to repair his image. Soon, malicious rumors began to circulate. They said I was a problematic employee, that I neglected patients to dedicate myself to political activism, that I was trying to extort the company with false accusations. On some local internet pages, anonymous comments called me greedy, a liar, and even a terrible mother. It was painful to read. Even knowing they were orchestrated attacks, the words still weighed heavily. Some nights, I cried in secret, afraid my children would see. But with each attack, hundreds of people appeared online defending me. It was as if I had become the face of a collective struggle. I remember one message in particular, sent by a woman from Texas. Rebecca, I lost my job 2 years ago because I questioned my boss about unpaid overtime. I stayed silent. You did not. Thank you for fighting for all of us. It was at that moment I realized, my story was no longer just mine. It was the story of thousands of anonymous workers, suffocated by the same kind of exploitation. And by that point, there was no turning back. The whole world was watching. The pressure, already immense, reached nearly unbearable levels. The more people followed my story, the more desperate Blackwood became to maintain appearances. That's when he hired a public relations firm to manage the crisis. Their plan was cruel and calculated. They spread rumors that I was a problematic employee, unstable and self-interested, trying to extort money from the company. They fabricated that I was neglecting patients to engage in political activism. These lies circulated in local newspapers and even on radio programs. I felt hurt, but not defeated. I knew the truth was stronger than any purchased narrative. Still, every word weighed on me like a stone on my heart. I stayed standing only because of Tyler and Emma. The trial began on a sunny Monday in May, a date that would be forever etched in my memory. The courtroom was absolutely packed, journalists with notebooks and cameras, labor activists with signs outside, Sunrise Manor employees observing silently, and dozens of people who had learned my story through social media and wanted to witness this historic moment. The air was thick, the anticipation almost suffocating. Tyler and Emma stayed with my sister. I knew that, even from a distance, they were rooting for me. Before leaving home, Tyler had hugged me tightly and whispered, "Mom, you're going to win. You always win when you fight for what's right." Those words echoed in my mind as I sat at the counsel table beside Michael Thompson. Michael was impeccable. Perfectly tailored suit, steady gaze, confident voice. From the first minute, he commanded the room with his presence. He brought hundreds of pages of documentation, recorded conversations, and colleague testimonies. Every piece of evidence was presented clearly, each detail meticulously built like bricks in an impenetrable wall. The most powerful moment, however, came when Mrs. Ruth Johnson, now 85 years old, appeared in her wheelchair. The entire courtroom fell silent. Even the reporters paused writing for a moment. When she began to speak, her frail but determined voice carried through the walls. Rebecca Carter is not just an employee. She is an angel. An angel who sacrificed time with her own family to care for strangers like me. If anyone in this world deserves justice, it is her. Some jurors discreetly wiped their eyes. I myself cried quietly, trying to compose myself. It was as if every word she spoke washed away the lies that had been invented about me. Blackwood and his lawyers tried everything. They painted me as a dissatisfied, exaggerated employee who used activism as an excuse to enrich myself. But the documents did not lie. The clock-in and clock-out records, the security cameras, the medical reports I drafted late into the night, all proved I was telling the truth. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the direct confrontation between Michael and Richard Blackwood. The silence was so dense you could hear pens clicking. "Mr. Blackwood," Michael began, walking slowly toward the witness stand, "you drove an $80,000 BMW while denying $200 per week in overtime to a single mother?" Blackwood swallowed hard. "My personal assets are irrelevant to company policies." Michael didn't flinch. "You spent $15,000 in a single weekend in Las Vegas, the same month you told Mrs. Carter she already earned enough for her basic needs?" Blackwood's forehead glistened with sweat. That is irrelevant." "Answer the question, Mr. Blackwood." "Yes, but that doesn't mean—" "Thank you. No further questions." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Blackwood sank into his chair as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The jury retired. I felt each minute like an eternity. I paced back and forth, hands trembling, heart racing. Michael, calm, simply said, "Trust, Rebecca. We've built a solid case." 3 hours later, the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding the verdict. My breath caught. "In the case of Carter versus Sunrise Manor LLC, we find the defendant guilty of systematic violations of the Fair Labor Standards Act. We award the plaintiff compensatory damages of $125,000, punitive damages of $2,875,000, and order that all affected employees receive full compensation for unpaid overtime." $3 million. My legs gave way. Michael held my arm and whispered in my ear, "You did it, Rebecca. You really did it." I looked at Blackwood. He was as pale as paper, surrounded by lawyers fanning him as if they could return his lost dignity. But nothing could erase that moment. It wasn't just a financial defeat. It was the collapse of all his arrogance. It was justice finally standing tall. And I knew, from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The victory did not end in the courtroom. The consequences came quickly and relentlessly. 3 weeks later, Blackwood was no longer the same man. He was forced to sell his BMW, his lakefront vacation home, and even the Rolex he so proudly flaunted. Each asset sold was a symbol of his pride being dismantled piece by piece. Meanwhile, Sunrise Manor passed into new ownership. Their first measures were to implement fair pay policies and create an employee committee to ensure that no injustice would be repeated. It was like witnessing a new era being born in the place that had once been a stage for exploitation. With my share of the $3 million, the changes in my life were profound. I paid off all debts, bought a house for myself and the children, and finally breathed a sigh of relief knowing their future was secure. I set up an educational fund for Tyler and Emma, but I didn't stop there. I took the rest of the money and gave life to something bigger, the Carter Foundation for Labor Justice, an organization that provides free legal assistance to exploited workers. What began as my personal struggle had turned into a banner for thousands. 3 years passed. My inbox is constantly full of messages from workers seeking guidance, sharing their stories, and asking for strength. I give lectures at universities, appear on TV programs, and help lawmakers strengthen labor laws. Tyler, now 12, dreams of becoming a lawyer like Michael Thompson. He proudly says, "I want to help people like you, Mom." Emma, now 9, finally fulfills her dream of dancing ballet and always repeats, "I want to help Mom fight for workers." Mrs. Ruth Johnson continues to live at Sunrise Manor. I visit her every week. Every time she sees me, she holds my hand and says, her voice still trembling but full of affection, "You've proven that one brave person can change the world, dear Rebecca." And she is right. The victory against Richard Blackwood was never just about money. It was about dignity. About proving that ordinary workers can bring down giants. It was about showing my children that fighting for what is right, even when it seems impossible, is always worth it. Time has passed, but that feeling I had in the courtroom still follows me as if it happened yesterday. Sometimes I close my eyes and remember the silence before the verdict, Blackwood's desperate gaze, and the strength with which Michael held my arms so I wouldn't collapse to the floor. But, above all, I remember the hug from Tyler and Emma that night. They ran to me with tears in their eyes and said, "Mom, you won for us." And it was true. The fight had not been just for overtime or labor justice. It was for them. For every mother who comes home exhausted and still has to smile for her children. For every worker who feels invisible in a system that values only profit. Today, every time I step on a stage to speak, every time I receive a letter from someone who found courage in my story, I am certain life may try to crush us, but there is always room to rise, resist, and turn pain into victory. And if you've followed this journey this far, remember, you can too. No matter the size of your struggle, no matter the weight of the opponent, with perseverance, truth, and courage, anyone can turn the tables. And that is exactly why I share stories like this here on the channel. Because I believe that when a story of courage is told, it ignites a flame in those who hear it. So, if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share this video with someone who needs strength to keep fighting. Justice may take time, but when it arrives, it transforms everything. And it can transform your life too.